Okay, hello everyone. Hope you guys had a nice heat wave day yesterday. Boy, summer really came early this year. I mean, anybody not from Seattle? Anybody not been here during the summer at all? Okay, well, you guys are in for a real treat because it's awesome in the summer, but it's not usually this awesome. It doesn't get awesome until like late July, mid to late July, and then it's awesome all the way through like late September, really, oftentimes. But this is crazy. Like we got a big old heat wave in when was it, like early May or something? That awesome sunny like 2 weeks or something. This is crazy. Must be, what is it, La Nina or something? The opposite of El Nino? I don't know. Okay, let's see. So I want to start off continuing where we left off on Friday. There are a couple more things that changes that I want to make to our page that we were working on. So we went through lots of the CSS, sort of basic CSS rules and styles. And we got to the portion where we were discussing page sections. And we learned the div tag and the span tag. A div is a block level element that groups other block level elements together so that you can sort of identify that thing as a particular area of the page. A span is for an inline element that just sort of marks a span of text as a particular thing. You can attach ID or a class, an ID or some classes to it, or both, to mark it for as a target for styling. We also talked about HTML5's new page section tags. These are some tags that you can use if you like to indicate like what portion of the page is the header portion, what portion is the footer portion. A heading, not to be confused with header, is a compound heading. Like maybe you've got two H1s together that both comprise the title of the website. You can put those together in a heading tag that groups them together. I think of these section tags, including div, as, like I said, rubber band elements. They group other elements together so that they're identified as a particular section of a page or particular area. Yeah. Header, so this is really confusing, right? Because there's header, there's heading, and there's head, right? Head is the very top portion of the document that only describes meta information about the page. That's as opposed to the body. The body is where you put these two tags. These two tags go inside the body. The header, you might have a heading inside of the header. But you wouldn't necessarily have. You could also have headings elsewhere in the page, like in the main portion of the page. If you have like multiple blog entries, each blog entry has a title, and you might wrap each title in a heading. If you've got like an H3 there, and maybe you've got like a byline or something, you want to group those together into a heading. That's one example of using a heading. Nav is a navigation area. Aside. Tangentially related, oftentimes is used for sidebars, but like left portions of the page or right portions of the page. But it's also sometimes used for like footnotes and things like that. Whatever you just sort of semantically associate with being an aside, you can use it for. Section, this is oftentimes, I sort of use this for like the central area of the page because none of the other tags sort of fit, so I just use section because it's a section. And you can have sections within a section and so on. Anyhow, I don't want to spend too much time on these. You can use these if you like. I'm pretty much going to focus on divs and maybe use a few more of these. We also talked about context selectors. The space context selector selects an element if it's inside of another element. The right arrow selector, this is one that lots of students are really tempted to use a lot, but it's actually much less useful than you think. So I wouldn't really focus on learning too much about this one. This is the one that we're going to be using a lot of, the space selector. What this one does is it restricts this element to being directly inside of this element. So if I have, let's go back to our example that we worked on I'm just going to move these things over. No, I can't do that. Let's do it down here. copy these over. Oops. What did I do? Copy, paste. Okay. So we had this first page that we started working on Wednesday, and it looks really great. Lectures. We deleted a lot of the really obnoxious stuff, but it still looks pretty good. And what I want to do is I want to separate this into more like page sections. I want to add page sections to this document. So probably the easiest thing, the first thing that I can do is up at the top of the page I can just wrap, like this is my header probably, like I mean I could have like other stuff in the header, like maybe like a list of links. You know, this is my blog, about me, contact, you know, whatever. If these were links, maybe these would be up in the header as well. I can wrap this whole thing in a header tag to indicate that this is the header portion of the page. Let's indent this stuff. Okay, so this is the header now. I can also, let's see, so I've got a portion here that's, let's see, I have an objective, I have an experience, I have skills, I have endorsements, and I've got a footer. Maybe this whole resume portion here, I will make a section, because that's what it is. It's a portion of the page, so I'll call it a section. Go up here, indent this stuff. There we go. Okay, so I've got a couple different page sections going on here. So what I'm doing is I'm using HTML5's newer page section tags. What I could do is, equivalently, I could just use divs. Divs are sort of the generic grouping tag if you don't want to use the newer HTML5 tags. So I could replace header with div, I could replace section with div, I could replace footer with div. The only reason they added these is that they realized it was so common to have div ID equals header, div ID equals footer, div ID equals section, or like class equals section, things like that. So they just decided to introduce these tags to make it a little bit easier for everyone. Let's see. I want to maybe style some things differently depending on where they are in this page. One of the things that I did was I styled the code that was inside the welcome area differently from any of the other code. So let's look for code. So there's a code up here. Hi, my name is Morgan. I like to web dev. Specifically, I like the code tag. It's kind of meta. And then down here, I have another one. This is an example of my elite coding skills down in the footer. Doesn't really make much sense to be in the footer, but that's okay. Actually, let's move this out here, and we'll have like a real footer. Okay. So this would be like H2 coding samples. Okay, and I want to outdent this pre-tag. This pre-tag, pre is one of the tags that is an exception for indentation. You have to have it flush to the left, otherwise all of your white space will show up in there, and you don't want that. Okay, an example of my elite coding skills. So this is a code that's inside of the section, so like both of these are inside the section. I'm going to call this section, main, because this is the main content area of the page. Or actually, maybe I'll call it resume, because that's more like what it is. And if I want to style this code differently, maybe I'll say pre-class equals sample code, so that this is like I don't know. This is like a more involved pre-tag. So maybe what I'll do is so what I did down here is I styled it inside the welcome. Let's see, where's welcome? Oh, did I undo that? I think I might have accidentally undid that. Welcome, this is the welcome. Welcome? No, this is the welcome, I think. Yeah, okay. So that's the welcome. I had a code inside there and I styled it differently. Okay, let's refresh the page to see how that is. So I styled the code inside that differently. So I styled welcome to be italic, so the entire paragraph is italic. And then I undid the italic on a code inside of welcome. So the whole thing is italic except for the code, which I've undone the italic on. I can also, if I want to, let's see, so I'm styling pre-code to be background color yellow. That affects the code that's down here that's inside of a pre-tag. That makes that yellow. If you want to see an example of the right angle selector, you can do that. So section ID equals resume, PID equals welcome. What we could do is we can say we had a div whose ID is welcome, and inside of that there's a paragraph, and inside the paragraph there's a code. Okay, so div paragraph code. The code is not directly inside the div ID of welcome. The code is now directly inside the paragraph, and the paragraph no longer has the ID of welcome. So if I make this welcome arrow code, this will no longer apply because code is no longer directly inside of welcome. It's a child of welcome as opposed to just a child of welcome. So when we talk about elements being nested inside of each other, we often use the sort of parent, sibling, child relationships. This P is a child of the div whose ID is welcome. The code is a child of this paragraph. This right arrow is a child selector, which means that code has to be a direct child of welcome. So this will no longer apply. So when we refresh the page, this code tag will become italicized again. There it is. Okay. So I've done a couple more page sections on the page. Why don't I do a couple more things differently? Maybe I'll just make like the header, I'll make like, what do I want to do with the header? I want to make that text decoration underline. Underline everything in the header, so all that stuff is the header. Maybe I will change all of the headers inside of the resume section to be a little bit different. Maybe I'll say, so resume, what are they, H2s? They're all H2s. So I'll say that those are font size 50% and color green. So those are pretty tiny. Okay. Excellent. Okay, I think that's good enough for now. We're going to move on to some new material for today, and then we're going to start an example which uses some more page sections. What's that? Oh yeah, the page. Yeah, it's pretty obnoxious. We'll move on. The page that we're going to do later is a lot nicer. Yeah. Yes, that's a very good point. He said, whenever we're designing, we're going to need to use IDs and or classes, and it's difficult to decide which of those we should use. That's very true. The rule of thumb that I would say is that if you have something on the page that's absolutely unique, it's not going to be repeated anywhere on the page, then it's probably safe to give it an ID. If you associate that thing with just a unique individual thing, you can go ahead and give it an ID. if you can, on the other hand, if you can plausibly imagine that sometime in the future you might add another element on the page that is similar to it, that should share the same styles, then you should give it a class instead of an ID. You can combine IDs and classes on an element. That's very frequently done. Something that has an ID can also have classes associated with it. So you don't necessarily need to choose one or the other. You can choose both sometimes. Okay. Today we're going to talk about another portion of CSS, another somewhat confusing portion. Actually, we're going to talk about two confusing things today. The first is the box model, the CSS box model. Actually, I'm going to skip this slide and talk briefly about block elements and compare block elements to inline elements. So block elements, as I mentioned earlier, are basically containers for inline content. So they're a block area, a boxy kind of area that contains inline content, just plain text. It also contains inline elements. If you look at this, this is an example of a paragraph. It's a blocky sort of container. It's got some text inside of it. It's got an EM, an A tag, and so on. So it's got inline content inside of it. Yeah. Frames are sort of, I mean, frames are very different conceptually. They each load a different document inside of them, but functionally, sort of, yeah. You can, if you apply certain CSS styles to them, you can make them function kind of like frames. Yeah. By the way, if you don't know what frames are, you don't need to know because they're really old and nobody uses them anymore. They were terrible. Because they're block elements, they contain text inside of them. The text inside of it wraps to fit the width of that element. So that element is a square or a rectangle, and if you adjust the width of that rectangle, then the text rewraps. Many block elements have default margins and or padding for white space. We'll talk about that in a second. Inline elements live inside of block elements. They live on lines of text with other just plain text. So you might have a paragraph with just plain text inside of it, and the paragraph every once in a while might have a link or an EM tag or a strong tag or whatever. Those three types of tags, A, EM, strong, those are three common examples of inline elements. They live on the line of text. They get rewrapped inside their containing block element. Yeah. An image falls actually. An image is actually a hybrid. It's sort of a combination of the two. We'll talk exactly about how that works in a bit. But it lives on a line of text, but technically it's actually also kind of a block element. It's called an inline block element. So it's a hybrid. But for now, we can treat it like an inline element. So the box model. This mostly applies to this applies to some extent to inline elements, but you can mostly think about this as applying to block elements. Every element on the screen, let's view this image separately. Every element on the screen has dimensions, and it has some additional properties that allow you to specify spacing. So the most, the innermost portion of an element are its width and height. This is where the text is. If you have text inside of this, the text will wrap to fit the width, and the height will expand to fit, allow the text to all be contained inside the element. So the height will grow or shrink to the end of the text. Outside of that, we have padding. Padding is space around the text content inside of it. Between the text content and the border. Border is something that you can just assign different, there are different styles of borders. You can make them solid or dotted or dashed or whatever, it's just a border. You can adjust the thickness of it. It's what you would think of as a border. And then outside of that is what's called the margin. The margin is what spaces this element apart from other elements, apart from other block level elements. So this element, if we take a look at the document flow of block elements, by default, all block elements are just stacked one on top of another, going all the way down the page. So examples of block elements are H1, H2, P. UL is a block element. LIs inside of ULs are also block elements. They're just stacked one on top of another all the way down the page, and they occupy 100% width of whatever they can occupy. However much space they can occupy horizontally, they will take that up, unless you actually restrict the width. And then inside of each of those, there's inline content. The spacing between these elements, so you can think of this gray thing, the darker gray thing, as a border. There we go. You can think of the darker gray thing as a border, and the white space in between, you can think of that as margin. It's what spaces this element apart from the element next to it. Okay, so CSS properties for things. Borders, you can specify like this. This is sort of a condensed version of the border property. You specify all three things at once: the width, the style, and the color. Thickness can be specified in some unit of measure, pixels or ems or whatever, or you can just do these sort of relative things, thin, medium, thick. Those are the thicknesses of those are determined by the browser. Style, bunch of different styles. My favorites are dashed and solid. All the rest of them are pretty like whatever. Maybe I might use double sometime or dotted. And then color is just specified normally as colors are. If you want to specify more specific elements, you can expand that border property into very specific elements like border color, border style, border width. We'll change the border on all four sides. If you want to get really specific, top, right, bottom, left, you can specify all three things on the top, right, bottom, left. Or you can get really, really specific and just target the width on the left or the color on the top or whatever. So those are more border properties. So another example, this element has left border of thick dotted, this fuchsia kind of color, and a bottom border that is double and this sort of teal color. So it has two completely different borders applied to it. And they're applied different ways. In this one I'm using border left and specifying everything. And in this one I'm using border bottom color, specifying the color of the bottom first, and then border bottom style, specify the style second. Rounded corners, this is a newer CSS3 feature. You can create rounded corners by using border radius. That just calculates if you turn the corner into a circle, what will the radius of that circle be? So that's kind of cool. Padding. So padding lives on the inside of the border as opposed to the margin, which lives outside of the border. Marty often likes to think of padding as being inside, you know, like in your belly, whatever. So padding, this is just like most CSS properties that have multiple dimensions. You can specify all four of them at once, or you can specify each one individually. Let's see, so padding at 20 pixels. This is just 20 pixels between the top of the text and the top of the element, and the left side here and the bottom side and so on. We don't have text that is stretching the entire width of this. Remember that I said a block level element will by default occupy as much width as it can. So it's occupying as much space as it can inside of this other element, so that there's another element here with this light blue dashed, right, that is sort of containing that block level element. That element is expanding to fit the entire width. If we had text that was long enough to go over here and wrap, then you'd also see that there's another 20 pixels over here. So one of these, another one. What is this gap in here? This gap between these two paragraphs? Yeah, it's margin. Why is it there? We haven't specified it. It's a browser default. So the browser by default, most browsers by default in their inherent internal style sheet will apply one margin or 1 em of margin to the top and bottom of paragraphs and lists I think also list items, and others, some others. Most of them actually. Headers also. The only one that doesn't have any default margins or any default styling whatsoever is div. That doesn't have any default margins. This is a heading that doesn't have any padding. By default, elements don't have any padding, by the way. So you can see that the background color, there's no extra space inside of that. By the way, if we apply a background color to this element, let's edit it with Firebug. We're going to add a background color of fuchsia. You can see that the background color extends through the padding. So this is the content of, this is the actual, like, if you measure from the top to the bottom of the cyan here, that would be the height of the element. And if you measure from the left to all the way over here, like 20 pixels from the right, that's the width of the element. And then the padding is surrounding that. So the background color bleeds through the padding. It doesn't, however, extend into the margin. Okay, this is an example with some other funky padding. We've got left padding of 200 pixels and top padding of 30. You can see that we don't have any bottom padding. It sort of might look like we have right padding over here just because there's a bunch of empty space, but that's just because the text is shorter. Margins. Again, you can specify margin or you can specify each side individually. Margin of 50 pixels, we'll set 50 pixels around each one, each side. You'll notice that, so there's 50 pixels here, 50 pixels here, 50 pixels here. But this one's also specifying a top margin of 50 pixels. So why isn't this 100 pixels? So, I mean, you'd think that maybe they would add together. But they don't, actually. Margins collapse. That's one of the rules about margins, is at least vertically, margins collapse so that the largest margin between the bottom margin of this and the top margin of this, the larger of the two is the one that's used. And they also don't contain any background color. Left margin on both of these. Sorry, go ahead. What's that? They don't contain, what did I say? Oh, they don't contain background color. Yes, thank you. Okay, so here we have a left margin of 8 ems, and then we still have the default top and bottom margins for this. Yeah. Yes. In fact, when I talked about BRs, I said that you should never use more than one in a row without any intervening text. So if you have 2 BRs in a row, that's bad. That's because you should be using margin for spacing. That's margin and padding are what you use for spacing. Yeah.
Would it be possible to do BR, set it to 90 and set the margin for that BR to be greater? Because then you could still use it as a large language instead of just as a language.
Possibly. I've never actually tried that. I don't know whether a BR tag actually can be the target of styling. I don't know whether it's an inline or block element. I don't know how to figure out which one it would be. I've never really thought of that before. It's possible, but and I can imagine circumstances under which you would want to use that. But it's never come up for me, so chances are you won't need to do that. But that's a great idea. Properties for dimensions. Let's see. So you can restrict, again, by default, it'll occupy 100% of the width that it's allowed to take up. This one, we've restricted it to being only 350 pixels wide, and that has caused the text inside of it to wrap. This one, we've restricted to be 50%. That 50% is with respect to whatever space it is allowed to take up inside of its parent element. So this is taking up 50% of the width of this element that it's inside of. Yeah.
Since you're creating the initial all different size monitors and whatnot, isn't there a percentage so that you don't end up with large monitors?
It's a good question. She said, since your page is going to be shown on all different sizes of displays, like it might be displayed on like a mobile phone, or it might be displayed on a really huge display. Wouldn't it be better to always specify percents instead of pixels? It's a really good question. I'm not going to address it now, but I will address it later. You can also specify height. Height blocks sometimes ignore height. For most blocks, you can specify height, but if you specify height of like 100%, that doesn't always work. If you specify a fixed height, like 100 pixels, then it'll actually grow the height to be that size. You can specify min and max if you want it to be if you want to allow it to grow and shrink within a certain range. Centering block elements. Okay, so we learned about text align the other day, and that allows you to modify the alignment of text within an element. So I'm going to set text align here to be center, and now this text is centered inside this element. I can make it right. Now it's right aligned inside this element. Maybe I'll add a background color here to just so you can see the boundaries of this element. You can see that it's right aligned to the right side of the element. This element, however, itself, the box of this element, is centered within its containing element. So there's an equal amount of space on the left here and on the right. And the way that we've done that is we've restricted the width of this element to be something less than something less than the width of its containing element, and we've set margin left and margin right to be auto. What auto means is it basically says put enough space there so that they're equal. So this is how we center a block level element. This block level element is centered, but the text inside of the block level element is right aligned. Okay? So there's a difference between centering the container itself and centering the content inside of the container. Does that make sense? I can do both of them just by saying text line center. And then that's really confusing. You don't know if we turned off the background color here, you wouldn't know whether the containing element was centered or the text inside of it was centered. Actually, well, I guess we do know that the text inside of it is centered, but we wouldn't necessarily know that the containing element is also centered. Okay, so that's the first confusing thing of the day. The box model properties. Why don't we, before we go on to floats, let's do a little bit of styling here. I'm going to be looking at a version of our course website here. We're going to be starting another example. This example is our course website. So this is our course website without any styles applied. So we're going to do a version of our course website with some styles applied, and we're going to style this up to look a little bit closer to our course website. So I'm going to go back to course website, and I'm going to take a couple of things. I'm going to inspect the page to figure out a couple of different things on this page. Maybe before we do that, we can just sort of see the general structure of the page. Up here this is probably the header of the page, right? We've got this logo here, and then to the right of that is a couple of what are probably headings, and then this looks like it might be a border of some sort. So that's probably what we'll try to do. Then this section here, we've got a bunch of things next to each other. We've got this and these things. Any idea what we might use for these links here? The links themselves will probably be A tags, right? But to mark up this sort of structure here. Exactly, yeah. So he said we can remove the dot. So if we make this an unordered list, we can remove the dot. Basically, anytime it could be a table, but it's not really appropriate for this to be a table. It's more appropriate for this to be a list. You could actually You could actually make this into a table. I'll talk about why it's a better idea to use a list set of lists later on. For now, that's just what we're going to do. We're going to make these into lists. This is going to be a list. This is going to be a list. This is going to be a list, and this is going to be a list. And they all have to appear next to each other. Okay, so that's something we have to learn how to do. Then this looks like it's like a border or maybe an HR or something. Then we've got a header here. This is probably a list, obviously. And maybe this is the footer. Okay. So that's the kind of stuff that we're going to need to find out. I'm just going to quickly inspect the page and figure out what the font is. So the base color is black. The base font stuff is this. So I'm just going to copy that. And the base font size is 10 points. So I'm just going to copy all of this if I can. Okay. Copying that, and the rest I'll just redo. Okay. So let's see, style.css. Oops, that's course.css. That's the style sheet we already created. So let's see, body tag. We'll say color black, font family. These I'm gonna put spaces here just because. And then, what's the last thing? Oh, font size. 10 points. Okay. Go back and refresh our page. Excellent. Okay. So that looks kind of like that. This looks a little bit different though. Let's take a look at this. Font family Verdana first, then Geneva, Arial, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is slightly different. So H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, all of the H's, those are Verdana first instead. So let's do that. H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. Font family Verdana first. Okay. There we go. Okay, so that's better. Okay, the next thing I want to do is I want to tackle the, let's see. We'll wait until we've, no, let's do this. Let's do the background colors of these list items. So let's just inspect that real quick. Background color of that is this. That uses a fancy CSS rule. We're going to do some other stuff. So maybe we'll say zebra stripe, background color that. So I'm going to make this a class because I'm going to apply this class to many different things on the page. And then we'll go up here and we'll find the, okay, so these are the things that are lists. And I'm going to do every other thing. I'm going to say class equals zebra stripe. That one, that one, that one. And that will apply that background color to every other thing. There we go. Okay. Okay. I think the next things that we want to do, well, maybe let's just do the this thing here real quick. Maybe we can make that a bottom border on this top section here. Maybe this whole top section is the header because it's got all the list of links and stuff. And that looks like it's maybe about 4 pixels wide and it's some kind of gray. So maybe I'll just say, I'll wrap all of this stuff in the header. Header. All that stuff's the header. We'll end the header here. And then I'll probably want to make a border on the bottom of that. So I'll say header, border, bottom, solid, 4 pixels, gray. We'll just assume that it's the built-in browser shade of gray. Okay, that's too dark, but that's okay. That's about, I think we got the width right. Okay, they may be last. Okay, so we've got these two and then this. The sizing of these is different, I think, than over here. These things are smaller and these things, this is larger. In fact, I think they're almost exactly reversed. Maybe this is a little bit smaller than this is over here. Actually, this is smaller too. So they're a little bit smaller. But let's modify those. See what the, so this is an H1, looks like here. So in this case, what he's done is, what Marty's done is he's put a BR inside of this H1. Another thing that he could have done, if he wanted to use some HTML5 goodness, is he could make them both H1s and wrap them in a heading tag. This is one of the purposes of a heading tag. It groups two header things together. So we could do that if we wanted. I'm going to say, let's see, H1. So the fact that I've made them both into H1s means that these will be spaced further apart now. So those are spaced further apart. How do I make them not spaced further apart? Margin. So I want to modify the margin. So I'd say maybe margin bottom 0. Right. Okay. So the top margin of the bottom one is still 1em, and the space between them will be the larger of the two. So I've set the bottom of the top to 0, but the top of the bottom is still 1. So margin top 0. Okay. Okay, that did that. And then just so that I retain the spacing on the top and the bottom of that group, I can make heading be margin top 1em, margin bottom 1em. Let's make the font size smaller. So font size, I'm just going to guess and say that it's maybe 60%. No, actually, sorry, the percent is going to be with respect to the font size of the base font size of the page. So let's take a look at, so this font size is the base font size of the page. That, I'm guessing, is exactly the same, it looks like. So we're going to make this font size 100%. It looks like I need to do the actual H1s inside of that. So you notice that the H1 overrided the font size 100% from heading. So what I wanted to do was affect the font size of everything inside of the heading, but H1 has a default font size that overrides that. So I have to specifically put it in the H1 tag. There we go. Excellent. And then this maybe needs to be a little bit bigger, so that is an H2. I'm going to make the H2 maybe H2 font size 175%. I think by default H1 is 200%, H2 is 150, so somewhere in between is I think what we're going for. Okay. This is really bigger, so we'll make that 125. There we go. Okay, that looks good. And then the last thing we need to do is we're going to need a border here somewhere. Let's put a bottom border on that, on the heading. Heading, border, bottom, solid, is it 4 pixels again? 4 pixels. And I think there's a light gray. There we go. light gray. Let's see if that does it. It's taking a while to refresh. Okay, so heading is not accepting a bottom border. What's that? Heading, border, bottom. Okay. Maybe we can put it on the top of this. There we go. But that's a little bit too close, right? So maybe we need to, we're going to need to adjust some properties here to get the spacing right. Looks like the bottom margin of this should be smaller. And what do you think about this? Like there's space on top of this, and there's space to the left of this. What do you think that is? Padding. Okay, we're getting a little bit picky here. That's okay. So the bottom margin of the heading, it looks like, needs to be less. So I'll make it a ½ an M. And then we're going to need to have some padding inside the H2. Padding top. Maybe we'll make that a ½ of an M. Padding left a ½ of an M. Actually, we'll just do the whole thing. Oh, and we also need to adjust the top margin. Margin top 0. We'll make the margin top 0 so that the bottom margin of this is the one that actually affects the spacing. Actually, before I do that, I'll just sort of show you real quickly how I might figure that out. If we inspect this element, this is the H2, if we inspect this with Firebug, another thing that we can do, besides looking at the actual styles that are applied here, we can go over this tab here called Layout. This is a great tab because this shows you exactly what elements are on the page. So you can hover over the width of this and you can see that it's this many pixels by that many pixels. The padding you can see is that. The border you can see is that. And the margin is the yellow. So in this, the margin is yellow, the padding is purple, the border is whatever color it is, I think. And then the cyan area is the width and height of the actual text portion of the element. So we can see that the top margin here is interfering. So if we make that 0, I'll refresh. Okay, H2. Margin top, oh, need to uncomment that. There we go, margin top 0, but we still need a bottom margin on that. I don't know why the box model properties aren't applying to the heading. I've made this a little bit more complicated. Class equals, okay, you know what, I'm just gonna revert this to the way it was here with the break. A compound heading is not necessary. So let's see, margin top, margin bottom, that should do it. There we go. Okay, so we've got extra space down the bottom, we've got some space around that. Everything looks pretty good. Okay. The next thing that we need to do is we need to make things appear next to each other. So this whole stuff up here appears next to this element here, and each of these lists appear next to each other. And that's the next thing that we're going to learn. It's called floating. So the CSS float property takes an element out of the normal flow of the document and moves it to the left or to the right. And then everything, all the text content of other elements flows around it. A good example of this is if you go to Wikipedia, load it. Okay. We can click on this British Transport Minister. Oops. Thank you, Firefox, for going so slow. So we can click on this guy. This, come on. Not only does this have things appearing next to each other on this page, so there's that thing appearing next to everything else. So we've got this sidebar over here that it has a particular height that's dictated by the elements inside of it. This is floated to the right side of the page, and you can see that the text that it otherwise would interfere with flows around it. So this text would normally span all the way to this side of the page, but this inline content is flowing around it. And you can see that at some point that ends, and the content occupies the full width of the page. So a float is an awesome element because it just allows all the text to wrap around it. It's pretty great. So the side can be either left or right or none. None is just the default. It's not floated at all. An example of a float, this image right here is floated to the left and all this content is flowing around it. So let's go back and modify our page a little bit. Our goal is we want to get this image here and this stuff here to be next to each other. Maybe I'll put this in a div. No, I won't. I'm going to, let's see. So this is an image. And I want that image, let's indent this a little bit better. I want that image to be next to this stuff. I want this stuff to be on the right of it. So how would I make this appear to the left? Yeah. Okay, I'll say AID equals logo. And I'll say that the logo is float left. Okay, excellent. So now this thing appears to the left. If we look at this page, we can see that all of this stuff appears, all the way to the left. That's because this floated element ended, and then stuff goes to the left again. We can modify like the margins and padding around this if we want to. Let's say that the image. So I put the float on the link. Let's just make sure that it still works if I float just the image. Okay, so that's pretty much the same. An image is interesting in that it's inline content. It lives on a line of text and it'll flow with a line of text, but it also has full box model properties. So I can say that the logo is not only float left, but it should have a margin of 1.5 ems on all sides. And that has the effect of spacing everything out. Why is that border stretching all the way behind it though? It's kind of funky. What's that?
It's the lens of the background on the area margin area.
Yeah. So let's put a background image on this, and we can see background image. Color red. If we put a background color on this too, background color fuchsia, we can see that the width of these things is still expanding the entire width of the page. They're still expanding the entire width of the page. It's just the inline content that's getting shifted over. So the inline content is moving around this floated thing, but the block element itself still occupies the full width. Any bright ideas as to how we could make that not happen? Sorry, say that again? We can float these elements as well.
Is it possible to prioritize floating? Like say I want this thing to float as far left as it can, and then the next one to float at much further left as it can fit after the first one?
The order of precedence, we'll see that in a sec. The order of precedence is like whichever is floated first goes to the left, and then the next thing goes to the right of that, and the next thing goes to the right of that. I'm going to do something, so I like the idea of floating them both to the left. That would accomplish the same thing. But I'm going to do something that's a little bit, I think it's a little bit nicer. I'm going to say that, so these are the things that I want to appear a little bit further to the right. I want the block element to start further to the right. So I'm going to add a left margin to both of these to move their left edge further to the right. So I'm going to say H1 and H2, margin left, and that's going to be, let's see, so there's 1.5 ems on either side. That's 3 total plus the width of the image. I don't know what the width of the image is, so I'm just going to have to guess. I'm going to say 6 ems total. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's just give these a background color as well. Blue, just to see where the left edge is ended up. Okay, that's okay. The problem with that is that problem with that is I specified the left edges in ems, and the font size of each of these is different. So because an M is relative to the font size, the larger the font size, the bigger an M is. So maybe I'll just do this in pixels instead. I'll say 150 pixels. There we go. Okay, you can make it more like 125 or something. Get rid of this blue. And that looks pretty nice. I'll make this maybe 1 1/4. And then that ends up showing up beneath it. Okay, lastly, before we leave, I want to make these things appear next to each other. Guess how we're going to do that? Floats. Okay, so okay, so each of these is in kind of a group in itself, right? So this is one thing, this is one thing, this is one thing, and so on. So I can't just float the ULs left because these headers are also need to be along with the UL. So any ideas as to how I can do that? Yeah, make this inside of a div, just like rubber band these things two together. So div, oops, and maybe I'll say class equals column. Div class equals column. So I'm going to create a column for each of these. Let's see, so check scores and other are both in the last column. Where's other? Oh, there's not there. Okay, and just by doing that, I haven't actually done anything because the div doesn't have any default styles to it. So, but I'm gonna say dot column float left. If I just do that, it's probably going to look kind of funky. So this doesn't look quite like we want it to. Why is that? Yeah, we're probably going to need to specify a width. So this thing right here is making the first one be really, really wide. So what we'll do first thing on Wednesday is we'll pick up with this and we'll make assign a width to them. The section for tomorrow has been posted. The section pre-section problems have been posted. Please print those out and do that problem before. Oh, I guess it hasn't been posted. Should have been. Please print those out and bring them to section tomorrow for your participation points.